And this is part of this is a lecture on which I was asked to produce on De-Westernizing Media Studies, which is a very broad set of terms. It was popularized by James Curran and his collaborator Park. I'm sorry, I'm sure I haven't pronounced Park's name correctly. He's a Korean. But the similar topic has been addressed by other people. Thussu, for example, wrote a book, Daya Thussu edited a book, Internationalizing Media Studies. And it's that broad area of concerns that I want to talk about. They are very broad questions, and I've divided them more or less like this. Where are the media we study located? Who gets to study the media? What theories do we use to study them? What methods do we use to study them? And is there or are there alternative approaches? I should say at the beginning that I'm not privileging the issue of de-Westernization. There are other issues in communication and media studies which should and sometimes do attract attention. Gender and ethnicity are the most obvious, but I was asked to lecture on de-Westernization, so that's what I'm lecturing on. The lecture will be sympathetic but critical review of the issues which are raised by scholars working in this area. As you already know, I am white, well, actually I'm pink, but white, Western, English-speaking male. And of course, my work reflects those realities. So in many ways, I'm probably the last member of faculty who should be giving this lecture. But I was asked to give it, so I'm giving it. Many of the audience don't fit those categories neatly, and obviously you're entitled to have different perspectives and different opinions. And particularly since this is not something I'm terribly sure about, something which is a work in progress. I was saying that this is a work in progress. I'm not particularly confident about what I'm saying today, even less confident than I usually am. So please, if we get time for discussion after all this chaos, I hope you'll put your views in. They're at least as valid as mine. So let's continue this. It doesn't seem to want to. Okay. So let's take the most obvious marker of Westernization. The language of scholarship are Western. Indeed, they're the language of the Western empires. The languages of scholarly publication are Western. Of the top 10 SSCI journals that I talked to you about a couple of weeks ago, only one is not in English. That's Comunicar, which is in Spanish, which again is an imperialist language, the major imperialism of the 17th century, for those of you who are not too familiar with European history. The language of the big international associations are Western. I should say the languages, sorry. The language of the so-called International Communication Association, the ICA, is English. At least for now. I imagine it's under pressure to accommodate Spanish because Spanish is increasingly spoken in the US. The languages of the International Association of Media and Communication Research, which is a much more international body really, are English, Spanish, and French. And those are the languages of the three largest European empires. There are no prominent international organizations that I know of that have Mandarin or Hindi or any other Arabic or any other widely diffused language as their working language. And in practice, for all of the international scholarship, English, the language of the USA, is the language that is used. The language of instruction in universities is frequently English. All of the TH times higher education's top universities, top 10 universities, and 17 of the top 20 are English language universities. Mostly again in the USA. The three that are not, one from Zurich, which I imagine uses Swiss German, but I can't swear to that, and Tsinghua and Beidar obviously use Mandarin. And that's a relatively recent development that they became in the top 20. English is increasingly used as the language of instruction at the graduate level in European Union universities. Although the national languages there are certainly not English. It's the language of instruction in Hong Kong and Singapore. The majority of the population in both of those countries is Chinese, certainly not what are called native English speakers. And remember, when I talked about what to do to publish in a top journal and complete a successful thesis, one of the key things I stressed was the need to get a native English-speaking proofreader to make sure your work gets the best possible reception. And as a recent scholar, Susina, put it, English is an additional barrier to achieving more equitable participation and diversity of perspective in scientific publications in the field of communication studies. There is a question. Thussu speaks of internationalizing, Curran and Park speak of de-Westernizing. I think Curran and Park chose that because they were writing in what we could call the high noon of globalization at the end of the 20th century. The focus of this perspective has shifted to a view of globalization as a universal phenomenon that is transforming the entire world. Thussu chose internationalizing because I think he held that states are still important. Yes, there are a great deal of international circulation, but states still remain central. The book is called Internationalizing Media Studies, indicating the continuing importance of the nation state in the contemporary media world. I think that certainly there are at least partial global issues to be addressed. Most obviously, the digital media means that we can no longer have a purely national view of media, although recent developments in internet governance seem to be moving away from the unified global media, much more towards the Chinese model of locally controlled and regulated internets. I think another factor we need to take into account, and I'll look back at this a bit later, is that the scholars who do media and communication studies inhabit, as I say, what Castells called the space of flows. We aren't rooted in one place. I'm a living example of that. I was born in the UK. I spent most of my career in the UK. I'm speaking to you because I worked in Hong Kong, which is a long way away. And I've flowed back again to the UK now that I no longer work in Hong Kong. So I think, you know, that trajectory is not unusual. In fact, both of the books that I took as markers consist mainly of nationally based discussions. They're about my contribution to Curran and Park is not actually nationally based. It's about post-communist countries in Europe, but it's certainly strongly regionally based. I hold the view that states are still significant actors in media and communication. They're still significant actors in other things. It's not the globe that's threatening to a war in the Ukraine. It's a state against another state. So it's not just media and communication. States remain the key, in my view, key players in media and communication and in international politics. But of course, there are also more general phenomena that mean that you can consider groups of states like the European Union or the United Nations or whatever as having some common feature. So I want to reject the globalizing view really in its crudest forms and argue for the continuing relevance of state boundaries and state practices. So what then does Western mean? It's a long time been central to discussion, but I think it's ill-defined and potentially very misleading. In a general sense, I think it signifies North America and Western Europe. When people talk about the West, they tend to mean North America and Western Europe. Very often they simply mean the USA, which is of course by far the largest and strongest component of the West. This common usage, I think, can obscure very important differences. One which has a relationship to us, it always struck me, is, you'll recall Hofstadter's conception that the West is marked by individualism and Asian societies are characterized by collectivism. I always used to think about this when I struggled to get on the MTR at Kowloon Tong. I didn't see any evidence at all of Asian collectivism in the riot that takes place when the train pulls in. And I always contrasted it with what happens at Oxford Circus when the Piccadilly line, actually, yes, the Piccadilly line pulls in, and people wait for people to get off the train, and then they get on the train. And this doesn't happen in Kowloon Tong. So I think, that the empirical evidence that I've encountered means that Hofstadter was talking absolute nonsense. That, the general, maybe there are some characteristics, particularly of the structure of the family, which are different between the West and Asia. I remember talking to a woman called Go Jinjie, who's then a senior professor in Tsinghua, and telling her that my daughter was at college in America, and telling her that I was paying for my daughter to be at college in America. And she said, you must be Chinese. Because Westerners, she thought, don't pay for their kids' education, whereas Chinese people, of course, do. And these kinds of generalizations, I think, need to be qualified very, very carefully. I think individualism itself may possibly fit the USA, or much of the USA, although I have to say that the New York subway is more like the London subway than the MTR, and the MTR is much more like Shanghai and Beijing than it is like New York in terms of crowd behavior. But if you say for the West individualism, the Nordic countries don't fit that very well at all. The Nordic countries have marked by one of the central categories, it happens to be Swedish, it's true in all of the Nordic countries, is the concept of solidarity, the fact that you recognize that you have a duty to help other people in society, and very far from the notion of individualism, which may possibly fit a lot of what happens in the USA. So I don't like these general terms, but we're stuck with them. Western, in discussion of media, in practice often means some distinctly non-Western countries. Japan and more recently South Korea are often, for many reasons, loaded into the concept of the kinds of countries we're discussing. Perhaps the term global north might be a better substitute in many circumstances. Global north, of course, includes Australia and New Zealand, so it's again a bit misleading, but it points to a community of experiences. An alternative, a popular alternative, is the West and the rest, which points to a division between if you like, the richer countries and the poorer countries. So another way of thinking about it is developed and developing. So all of these point to different parts of the problem we're looking at. I don't think any one of them fits perfectly, but I'm going to use the term de-Westernization because that's the general currency, and I want to make clear what sense I'm using it in. I don't, by the West, necessarily just mean North America and Western Europe. Certainly many of the people I identify in this talk come from elsewhere. So that's what we're talking about. The origins of our field, obviously and well known, originated primarily in the USA. An important but secondary influence came from Europe. And many of the early studies which helped form theory, two-step flow, for example, were US-based. Agenda setting is a US-based theory, and it was sort of theory based on US experiences and so forth. In many cases, there's no doubt about the Western influence of the spread of the field internationally. This is Winston Manno talking about Africa. The US Jackson College of Journalism superimposed its entire curriculum on the University of Nsukka, Nigeria. American universities, funded by substantial American aid, supplied the structure, staff, and much of the university curricula, including an entire journalism program, and in some cases, the journalists themselves, who were mostly Western trained. This is Banerjee talking about the Asian experience. Until the 1990s, there were only a handful of universities or colleges offering communication studies in Asia. Even those few universities or institutions that did offer media and communication studies were heavily dependent on Western scholarship and models. Asian media and communication studies embraced Western models and perspectives. According to Sylvia Weisbord, who is a leading scholar, former editor of the Journal of Communication, for example, Latin America is, according to this, he was born in Argentina, is an exception to this trend. What defined Latin American communication studies was a collective awareness about common processes in the region, coupled with a shared empirical questions and theoretical influences. Its identity was also grounded in a deliberate position against theoretical approaches identified with Yankee gringo scholarship government. So according to Weisbord, the development in Latin America was not heavily influenced by outsiders, or at least not American outsiders. However, he goes on to say, he cites a long list of European scholars, starting with Marx. Latin American scholars, he said, liberally blended insights from theories developed by John Berger and Louis Althusser, Walter Benjamin and Susan Sontag, Roland Barthes and Antonio Gramsci, Raoul Prebisch and Darcy Ribeiro, Herbert Marcuse and Regis Debray, Julia Kristeva and Theodore Adorno, and Paulo Freire and Jose Carlos Maria Tegui. Now, what I think about this is that what he's talking about, I think, is better understood as a trend which is more heavily influenced by Europe, and particularly Latin Europe, and particularly French theories, than by the USA. So although I think Latin America is a bit of an exception to the fact that it's US influence, I think even on Weisbord's own account, it's quite dependent on part of the West. These problems haven't gone away. This is Mano and Milton, Winston Mano and Viola Milton. Viola Milton, by the way, I haven't, that's not a misprint. Viola Milton writes both her names like bell hooks with lowercase first letters. The marginalization of African epistemologies from theoretical debates in media and communication studies parallels the routine socio-cultural, political, and economic disempowerment and exclusion of the continent's people from global processes. This is similar to how other previously colonized regions such as Asia, the Middle East, and Latin America have been epistemologically marginalized in spite of growing evidence of the depth and scope of their scholarly contributions. The discipline of media and communication studies has remained captive to theoretical and methodological approaches from the global north, especially European and American perspectives. The marginalization of media and communication staff, text, theories, methods, and scholarships from the global south has become routine within the top academic institutions in the powerful global north, and ironically, also in the global south. And that's them writing in the introduction to the Routledge Handbook of African Media Studies, published in 2021. And this is two other scholars. One among the many problems of media and communication studies today is that the heart of its fields, which sets the theoretical and methodological agenda, remains strongly centralized within a distinct context of mostly Anglo-American. While the periphery serves as a source of empirical data that explore and interrogate regional specificities. And that's again from 2021. That's from an issue of Media Culture and Society. I think issue 2021, number 1, which had a section on de-Westernization. So up until 2021, it looks as though the consensus view is that the West dominates the field. So I conducted a, Curran and Park identified 4 theories of the press. That they said that this meant that which is a very, very influential book by 3 US scholars. And they say perhaps the most striking feature of this book is how little its talented authors felt they needed to know. They display some knowledge of the American and Russian media, the American colonial and early English press, but little about any other media system. In other words, this very influential theory was based on a very narrow view of what needed to be theorized. And I think we could say that if you cast your mind back to the lecture I gave last semester about part of which was about paradigms in scientific research. I think the Kuhnian paradigm in the sense is this in the sense that Western, particularly US experiences are normal, and that other systems should be studied as abnormal or deviations. And I think that pervades the field. I don't think that means that people consciously think, yes, the US is normal and everywhere else is abnormal. But I think it's very often an unconscious starting point. It's the way that the subjects that they think should be interrogated, the theories that they use to do so, the evidence, what counts as evidence, and so forth. Like the Kuhnian notion of a paradigm, I think, is unconsciously held by many scholars in the field. I'd say the role of professionalism in journalism studies is a case in point. I'm so late, I won't develop that in detail. I think that concentration on a narrow range of human experience persists in many more recent and influential studies. Helen and Mancini's Comparing Media Systems, for example, is specifically focused on North American and Western Europe. And they were conscious about that. They said, this is what we're talking about. But many people have taken it up and to use for systems well outside Europe, despite the fact that the three system typology of three systems they use doesn't fit the majority of cases. Eventually, they responded 8 years later in an edited collection, trying to extend beyond the Western world, and the results were uneven. I think, however, it's true that a wider range of media and communications environments are studied today. I did a small and very non-scientific content analysis of 5 major journals in our field. They were examined during the 2021 publication year. I don't know whether there's a question. Oh yes, asked which systems were examined during the 2021 publication year. I divided the systems into the West, which consisted of USA, Canada, the European Union, UK, Norway, Australia, and New Zealand, which is roughly 11% of the world population. And the rest, mostly the remainder of the world, most of Asia, including India and China, the whole of Africa and Latin America, Russia and constituents of the former USSR, the Middle East, and some others, and uncertain or not clear. Studies which looked at Japan, Korea, South Korea, Hong Kong, those involved several countries, both from all the above categories, general studies of a theoretical nature, and those which the focus was unclear, but many of which were dominated by Western studies. So I've tried to take a relatively restrictive view of the West, and these are the results. I took the International Journal of Press Politics as an example of political communication, big part of our field. And 58% of the articles were about the West, 37% were about the rest, and it wasn't clear in the case of 7%. The Journal of Communication, which is, I suppose, the leading journal in the field, and which carries a lot of what you'd recognize as communication studies. 65% were about the West, 1% was about the rest. That was an article about China by Wang Haiyan, my former collaborator, and 10 were not clear. New Media and Society, which is about what it says, New Media and Society, very big journal, 109 articles about the West, 63% about the West, 13% about the rest, and 23% it's not clear. International Journal of Cultural Studies, which is, I suppose, one of the leading journals of cultural studies, 45% about the West, 38% about the rest, 16% not clear. Screen, the main journal of film, according to the HCI, film theory, 64% about the West, 29% about the rest, and 7% not clear. I consciously chose not to look at journals like Gazette, Javnost, Media Culture and Society, and others which are sort of quite self-consciously trying to be de-Western. I just took the central journals from the field. Now you can argue with which ones But I think that that's a fairly representative of the leading journals in the areas that we're interested in. And it's clear that they focus disproportionately on the West, that they overrepresent the minority human experience by a long, long way. In fact, within that, the USA is by far the most frequent single system considered. And interestingly, US scholars who are addressing US problems often fail to mention which system they are discussing. So if you find, let's say, a scholar from China or India or Finland or even the UK, it's easy to do the content analysis because it'll be in the abstract. Now, this is about the Finnish media system. And Americans, you have to dig and dig and dig, and very often you only ever find it if you go down to the methods section and you discover that the sample for this survey was 46 undergraduate students in a major Midwestern university. That they're taking the fact that it's about America as being something you don't even need to say. China is by far the most addressed of the rest. That it's, well, as I said, general communication. Wang Huan and I had an article rejected by digital journalism on the grounds that the authors probably wouldn't be interested in it. Their readers probably wouldn't be interested in it because it was about China. And I did a little survey back, and I found that in the last 5 years they published one article from China. So presumably, China isn't very important. Anyway, and there were no studies of India in the first 3 journals, and no studies of Africa either, incidentally. Both cultural studies and screen much more open to these sorts of issues. So cultural studies and film studies are much less, they're still heavily, disproportionately pro-Western, but they're not as bad as communication studies, political communication, and so on. Where is this scholarship done? Where is it located? So there's a disproportionate attention to a few Western systems, but are the people doing the research disproportionately Western in location? I don't think the nationality of the individual involved in the scholarship is the best measure of location. Many of the people involved in, for example, I was writing about the Chinese media system. My nationality is certainly not Chinese. And there has always been an international movement of scholars. You remember Lazarsfeld, who made the classic distinction between critical and administrative research, was born in Austria and made his name as a researcher in the USA back in the 1940s. So it's a long-term movement. I think one better marker is the institution in which the work is done. Yes, that's a better sense of where things happen. An earlier work, as I said above, most was done in the USA and to some extent in Europe. And in those days, the primary location, for example, of Lazarsfeld, but of many, many other scholars, was from Europe to the USA, very often for very understandable reasons. Many of them were Jewish, and in the 1930s, when the field was being born, being a Jew in Europe was very, very dangerous, and being a Jew in Germany was fatal. So they left and went to the USA. So understandable reasons for relocation, but nevertheless, that's the direction. There's some counter movement. Jay Blumner, for example, a famous TV theorist, moved from the USA to the UK. And there was always some degree of relocation from outside the West. So, for example, some 3 very famous general theorists about culture, Gayatori Spivak, Arjun Appadurai, and Chakrabarti, can't remember his first name. I think they're all Indian in origin, but they all work in the USA. By the start of this century, there was a greater diversity of institutional locations. Curran and Park, for example, had 6 authors from US institutions, 6 from UK institutions, 3 from South Korea, 2 from Australia, 2 from South Africa, 1 each from Israel, Hong Kong, Malaysia, Egypt, Sweden, Norway, Italy, and Japan. 17 out of 28 on this book about De-Westernizing were from the West, as defined above. Thussu had 5 authors from US institutions, 6 from the UK, 3 from Australia, 2 from Canada, 1 each from Colombia, India, Sweden, the Netherlands, Germany, France, and Finland. 21 out of 24 were from the West, in this journal about asking how to internationalize. Institutional location clearly remains predominantly Western. Today, 14, 15 years after Thussu, 22 years after Curran and Park, the international movement of scholars has gone much further. Many of the articles I analysed in the previous slide, it says page 5 here, that's wrong, were written by scholars who appeared from their names to be foreign to the system they were discussing, but who worked in institutions within the West. I don't know what their nationalities were. I can't tell if someone with a Chinese name writing in an American university is an American citizen or a Chinese citizen or a Singaporean citizen or whatever, but they're certainly working in US institutions. Where are scholars educated? Well, that's, I think, a good example of location. Asking where scholars got their intellectual formation. I've measured that by asking where did they get their doctorates? Another small, very non-scientific study. This time it's about a faculty of a well-known university with a high research profile in communication and film studies. Yeah? And the location of the school, I've recorded the location of the school from which they obtained their doctorate, where identifiable. So it's the country they got their doctorate, not the actual university. And these are my results. 23 of the staff had their PhDs from Hong Kong, 17 from the USA, 1 from Canada, 5 from the UK, 1 from Italy, 1 from the Netherlands, and 1 from India. So how can we categorize these? Well, 26 out of 49 have PhDs from the West, a majority, predominantly the USA. 48 out of 49 have PhDs from the global north. I think, Hong Kong, just look around you, is part of the global north. Maybe it's less part of the global north than it was 2 years ago, but nevertheless, it's still part of the global north. And so, 48 out of 49 in this research-oriented university come from the global north, and only 1 from the global south. In contrast, I looked at the 25 faculty of the Annenberg School at the University of Pennsylvania in the USA, probably the leading school in the USA on this subject. Anyone like to guess how many of them had PhDs from the USA? Celine?
Sorry, I've seen the answer.
Okay. Anyone else want to guess? No? Well, if you're guessing secretly and silently guessing 25, you're wrong. It's only 24. And the other one, the odd one out, has their PhD from the University of Oxford in the UK. So this isn't a two-way street, yeah? People go to the US, get their PhDs, and go somewhere else to teach. Whereas if you're going to teach in the USA, in the most elite institutions, by and large, you're going to come from the US. Your education is going to be from the US, and maybe you're going to get maybe you'll let 1 or 2 people from universities like Oxford, which isn't very good at media, actually, as it happens, maybe the LSE or whatever, in through the back door. So I think that's a clear Western domination. Western theory is a bit more difficult. It's been well known, however, since at least Said wrote Orientalism, which was an application of Foucault's concept of relationship between knowledge and power. Theories are also located. Said showed that European ways of thinking about the Middle East were clearly marked by both the desire and the reality of the West to dominate the Middle East, specifically France. Said, a Palestinian, but worked in the USA. Foucault was French and worked in France. Given that both education and location are very Western, it's likely that most unconscious theoretical research paradigms will reflect that in most cases. Certainly all the grand theories are Western. Yeah? Many of the mid-range theories and Merton's working hypotheses, recall what how I showed this classification from last semester, are similarly located. So I would argue that the relationship between power and knowledge is very strongly marked in media and communication studies. All the theories listed by Bryant and Myron, who I cited last semester, are Western. And this is De Albuquerque, I think probably Latin American, maybe Spanish scholar, writing in 2021. Non-Western scholars usually face a dilemma if they want to pursue an international scholarly career. On the one hand, mastering Western media theories is mandatory for taking part in international forums and exchanging experiences with people from different parts of the world. On the other hand, these theories are, in many aspects, foreign to their cultural backgrounds and in many cases seem inadequate for describing their own societies. The example I was going to go through is, but time has almost run out, was development communication, and I'm only halfway through. So, I mean, Park and Thussu, Curran and Park and Thussu all note that development communication was a central aspect in the history of the field, and the model of development communication was that the world was developing towards being like the West. This is Daniel Lerner, one of the major theorists. What America is, the modernizing Middle East seeks to become, and this is Eisenstadt, another major leading American theorist. Historically, modernization is the process of change towards those types of social, economic, and political systems that are developed in Western Europe and North America. And in those kinds of societies, the mass media are constitutive of the social order. You can't have modernity, in other words, without newspapers, radio, television, today the internet. Maybe that's postmodernity, but let's leave that debate aside. And these people reasoned that if societies are to become modern, they need mass media. And that's because modernity, in Weber's sense, implies a different kind of personality. He showed, he argued in Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, that the origins of modernity, of capitalism at least, were in a different kind of a Protestant religious personality. So if you're going to modernize Africa or Asia, the traditional personality needs to be replaced by a modern personality. And the media are central to this because they're what they called a magic multiplier. This is De Poole, another leading figure in development of communication studies. People in villages and impoverished cities everywhere have discovered a land of their heart's desire and know that there is a different way of life to their inherited rut. So one of the things the media is going to do is show people the betterness, or the better way of living that is available in a modern society, and it can help replace what sometimes called the indigenous knowledge system with the scientific knowledge system of Western modernity. Give you two simple examples of that. It means replacing Chinese medicine and Vedic medicine with Western scientific medicine. Chinese medicine and Vedic medicine are traditional. They're not scientific in inverted commas. And the task of modernization is to replace them with Western scientific medicine. And that is a program which has been carried out with some enthusiasm by many people. My doctor in Hong Kong, who was Chinese, educated in Australia, referred to practitioners of Chinese medicine as witch doctors. So, this is clearly a continuing and ongoing debate. So the media need to communicate modern ideas and values. And they need modern experts to communicate those ideas. This is not, I'm quoting people from the 50s and 60s, but these ideas have been heavily criticized, and there are alternative paradigms, but they remain enormously influential. This is from 2006 from a basic textbook about health communication. The emphasis must therefore be on effective communication rather than communication per se. We need to impart the right information to the right people in the right way at the right time. Simply providing more information per se cannot be a goal in itself. In other words, this notion that What the experts are doing is transmitting information to the inexpert, to the lay people, remains central to many aspects of contemporary communication theory, I think particularly health communication. What about Western methods? I think it's more difficult to make out a case for Western dominance here. Many methodological elements central to the field are certainly not Western in origin. Westerners believe that mathematics was invented by the ancient Greeks, but the historians tell us that there are at least 4 different locations for the origins of mathematics. Mediterranean basin was certainly one of them, but India, China, and Central America were also bases for the origins of mathematics. So, and these were independent developments. So we can't say that all methods, particularly mathematical methods, are Western in origin. The statistical methods in current use, however, are mostly Western in origin, empirically the case. I don't think that necessarily makes them useless outside of the West. I think this is a bit different from the issue about theories. Many of the quantitative data gathering methods common in the field are also Western in origin, the questionnaire, for example. But there are variable reports of whether they work very well outside the West. I remember listening to an Indian scholar telling me that, well, not telling me, he was addressing an international conference, that he had been administering questionnaires to rural Indians, this is some time ago, 30 years ago or something. And of course, he wanted to get a representative sample, so he needed women. But he wasn't able to go and interview women on their own. And he said, you know, you'd ask them the question, you'd watch them look at their husband before answering. Yeah? So, you know, there are questions about whether questionnaires work outside of the West, but I think there are also questions about whether they work inside the West. So I don't think this is a clear West-East division. And the validity of data gathering using qualitative methods is also frequently questioned on the grounds of intercultural differences. For example, the most famous controversy over an American anthropologist, probably the most famous anthropologist in history, Margaret Mead, who wrote a book about coming of age in Samoa, where she detailed the specific features of sexual practices of young women in Samoa. Subsequently, a New Zealand scholar in particular has questioned whether she'd actually done the research, or whether she was simply recording some jokes that were played on her by 2 young women. Now, there's a controversy over that, and it's probably the case that the critic is overstating, if not completely mistaking, the situation. But there's a controversy over anthropological work. If you want to look at the sort of the more formal thing, a man called Clifford Christians wrote a substantial work on, or a lot of substantial works on this. But you can make the same objections inside the West itself, that the kinds of methods used in qualitative research are problematized by cultural differences, by class differences, by gender differences, and so forth. So I'm not sure that I can make the same clear case for methodologies as I can for other parts of the field. There is, however, clearly there's still a problem. The answer, I asked 4 questions at the beginning. No. We mostly study Western media. Westerners mostly get to study the media. We mostly use Western theories to study them, and we mostly use Western methods to study them, but I'm not convinced that the methods are as clearly Western as the other things. These issues have been around a long time, but they're clearly getting worse. The rise of China and India are the 2 most obvious reasons for the increasingly severe crisis. Thussu called it Chindia, but that's a phrase from the 2010s rather than from the present, I think. It's getting worse, partly because the media systems are more and more difficult to ignore, because of the increasing economic importance of both of the countries, the increasing size of their economies and so forth, but also in terms of the origins of the new generation of scholars who increasingly come from outside the West. So the unavoidable question is, what is to be done? title of a novel by a man called Chernyshevsky, a Russian called Chernyshevsky, appropriated famously by Lenin. What is to be done about this problem? And unfortunately, I don't have an answer. I don't know. I think it is a problem, but I don't necessarily know what to do about it. It's a problem I regularly encounter. One answer, I'm not sure how useful it is the notion that there are alternative modernities. It's more or less a global phenomenon these days, urbanization, blah, blah, blah. Yes, they're all more or less global. But is it necessarily Western modernity? And can there be a plurality of modernities? For a start, for most countries outside of the West, modernity was thrust upon them. Hong Kong is a living memory of how modernity was thrust upon Qing China. It was, ripped out of China by the British. One can tell similar stories about India, similar stories about Africa, and so forth. Modernity was one of the consequences of the Western imperialist developments of the 19th century. Japan is the major exception. They saw what was happening in China and thought, we don't want that to happen to us. And they overthrew the existing shogunate, re-established the rule of the emperor. Well, that was the figurehead anyway. And they followed a conscious process of self-modernization. They said, looked around the world and said, who's got the best army? The Germans. Who's got the best navy? The British. So we'll have a German army and a British navy, and a German education system, because then at that point the university system of Germany was the model for the world, and so forth. And along with the Western modernity, they picked up some bad Western habits, like invading people, conquering them, and building empires. But they're an exception, and that's led to quite a strong tendency to think of modernity in a plural sense. Certainly, economic development has meant that modernity is more central to the experience of non-Western countries. Clearly, it's central not just to Hong Kong now, but to China as a whole, and increasingly in India and elsewhere. Some degree of hybridization, then, a mixture of Western and traditional cultures, ideas, beliefs, behavioral patterns, and so forth, is a commonplace. I mean, the example I always cite is the traditional color of a bride in Chinese culture is red. If you look at any representation of a contemporary Chinese wedding, she's wearing white, which is the Western, the Western model. Go on the Disney Shanghai website and have a look at how they market weddings. But other aspects of the wedding, like sort of the bridegroom and his supporters having to discover the bride, her being carried downstairs, and mother giving her shoes, and the meal in the evening, and so forth. Always very, very traditionally Chinese. It's a hybrid. It's a mixture of different elements of Western modernity and Chinese tradition. And that's, I think, is a common experience. Oh my God, I've got to go downstairs for one moment. I'm sorry, this is just chaos. Sorry, Amazon. So hybridization, which is at least evidence that modernity isn't singular, is common. Japanese scholar Koichi Iwabuchi argues that Japanese, Asian, more generally Asian modernity can recenter modernity around non-Western experiences. He wrote, the experience of forced appropriation modernity in the non-West has also produced polymorphic, indigenized modernities, and thus has destabilized the exclusive equation of modernity with the Western world. Accordingly, people in the non-West have become disposed to mutually recognize and appreciate dissimilar non-Western experiences of urbanization, modernization, and globalization. And a Chinese scholar, Chen Kuan-Hsing from Taiwan, has, in a book called Asia as Method, wrote, "The potential of Asia as method is this. Using the idea of Asia as an imaginary anchoring point, societies in Asia can become each other's points of reference, so that the understanding of the self may be transformed and subjectivity rebuilt. On this basis, the diverse historical experiences and rich social practices of Asia may be mobilized to provide alternative horizons and perspectives." I think those are very similar views. Another way of approaching the question is the idea that there may be new sources of theory. There are rich traditions of social thought outside the Western tradition. Marx, Weber, and Durkheim aren't the first people to think about what we would today call sociology. It's usually attributed to an Islamic scholar called Ibn Khaldun, who flourished about 1,000 years ago. So there are other traditions apart from the Western tradition. This is Thussu. A global history of institutionalized education would take into account non-European trajectories of knowledge creation and dissemination. It would note, for example, that centers of higher education in Taxila in present-day Pakistan and Nalanda in India existed for a millennium before universities were established in Europe. That Egypt's Al-Azhar University, established in the 10th century, was set up more than 100 years before the first university in Europe, which was Bologna University, founded in 1119. So there are other traditions. They may not be well known, and that could be because the people who have written the history and thought about the things actually didn't know about them, or perhaps didn't want to center them. And they sometimes provide different answers to those emanating from the Western tradition. This is Mano and Milton again. Our reappraisal of Afroecology, which is what they call African-centered basis for social inquiry, is premised on decolonial epistemological conviviality through which African knowledges can enter into purposeful and critical dialogues with other sources of knowledge. Decolonial thinking is underpinned by tactical strategies, mobilizations, and hegemonic reconceptualizations that create new spaces. Our vision for Afroecology recognizes that the basic tenets of Western knowledge, i.e. Cartesian rationality, teleological, focusing on a foreseeable end goal, and universal reasoning, the idea of only one possible rationality, are historically situated and potentially restrictive if universalized throughout. And as such, they prevent the imagination of other possibilities. So they develop what would be distinctive as an Afroecological alternative. I haven't got time to go through this now, I don't think so. You can look at it at your leisure, I hope. It's Milton and Mano. My own views, as I say, hesitantly expressed. I think it's undeniable that contemporary scholarship reflects a Western view of the world. I don't think that there can be any serious objection to that. The languages of scholarship are Western, primarily English. The educational opportunities are disproportionately available in the West. Research universities are disproportionately concentrated in the West. Western problematics are more thoroughly researched than any others. So this is a problem. Institutional questions are problems. The theoretical and methodological problems, I think, questions are less easy to resolve. Uncritical universalism is certainly a danger, but so I think is uncritical particularism. The belief that what I think and do is the same as what everybody else thinks and does everywhere in the world is clearly nonsense. But it's also problematic to say, well, what I think and do is particular to, I don't know, to the United Kingdom or to England, or to North London, or the particularism. I mean, I think it's particular to North London, but the particularism is, I think, almost as much a problem as uncritical universalism. And I worry about the fact that there are the idea that there can be different epistemologies, or whether the different epistemologies have equal status. Are there many? I can believe that there perhaps are many different ways to knowing things, but are there different ways to knowing things which result in different conclusions? I don't know is the short answer. And do all research methods have unavoidable cultural limitations? I don't know is the answer. I mean, these I think are problems which I can't answer. Perhaps you can. And if there are these big differences, can we sustain what's sometimes called the Republic of Letters? Unless we have some common agreement about what we're talking about, how can we talk to each other? There's also a practical problem, of course. For Western senior scholars, it's difficult once you recognize that there is this problem. How do you advise your students on their work? What do you say to a doctoral student who wants to break with the central tenets of Western scholarship? Do you say, go ahead and do it, and risk trouble? Or do you say, well, no, maybe when you're a tenured professor, you can do this, but right now you really ought to make sure that you use a well-established theory in developing your thesis. And what do you do when you get an article which comes from outside of the Western model? How do you referee it? So I think it's a problem that Western scholars face. It's, at least for some junior scholars, it's much more serious. If you are sympathetic to the idea of de-Westernizing, should you risk being rejected or misrecognized by your seniors, of getting your articles rejected, not getting tenure and so forth? That's a real risk, I think. For many universities, I think the problem is one of extending what I call equal opportunities. I think that Baptist has been, at least in the doctoral program, has been pretty good on that. I think that it hasn't stuck with the local. It's made efforts to recruit students from elsewhere, but it is a problem that there's a tendency to recruit people who think like you, who have potential to be like you. For scholarly journals, this is a problem that I confront quite a lot as an editor of a scholarly journal, or as one of the editors of a scholarly journal. First of all, you have to say, well, you get articles from which don't seem to address what you think are important questions. And I've said previously, that I've been sick and tired of writing articles on Chinese media and sending them to journals, and who've said, well, look, you need to establish that this subject is worth talking about. And I've got this standard paragraph which says, the Chinese media system is the second largest in the world. It is the major international alternative to that of the USA. It is therefore important that scholars address the problems of this system. You have to do time and time again. That there isn't an automatic recognition that an article about local press in El Paso is important. An article about local press in Shanghai is not important, because the US is important and China isn't important in the unconscious of scholars. And I think extending the range of editorial inputs is really a major difficulty. And I didn't do a content analysis, but most of the editors of major journals are Westerners. I mean, on Media Culture Society, we're all either from the West or working in the West. And finding people from outside the West to be active editors is a major, it's something we're trying to solve, but it's not easy. Finding people who are prepared to do it is difficult. And helping non-Western scholars to develop their work for publication, insofar as one can, because it's very time consuming. But you will read, as the editor of a journal, all sorts of articles which have got something interesting to say, but don't say it according to the norms of Western scholarship. And what can you do? Can you patronizingly say, oh yes, we'll let a few of these people in, or no, we're committed to certain international standards? I think it's a real problem. I think the answer we would like to have is we should help these people develop their work for publication. But of course, that's impossibly time consuming. So I think there are real problems in solving this. Okay, at last, conclusions. The problem is deeply embedded in current scholarship. It has an intellectual dimension for sure. There are issues about theory and method, but it also has an institutional dimension. I think we should be able to resolve the intellectual dimension with open and honest discussion. After all, we are supposed to do that, develop theories, critically review evidence, accept superior explanations, and so on. Of course, that may only be a Western definition of scholarship. It may just be me being a Westerner. Institutional dimension is more difficult. It ultimately rests upon material resources. We increasingly confront the issue of de-Westernization because the distribution of the world's material resources is changing. That basically the West is in decline and Asia is growing, and that the resources to conduct scholarship are shifting from the North Atlantic to the Indo-Pacific, and so that's why the problem is getting more and more obvious. But there are obdurate imbalances that will not vanish overnight. For good or ill, changing the world is not something that scholars are competent to do, at least as scholars. But we can, I think, do our best to make sure that the injustices and inequalities in our own small field don't just simply get forgotten. Okay, I'm sorry to go on for so long. I'm sorry to be so chaotic, but that's the best I can do with this existing connection. I welcome violent disagreements or whatever, but that's it. Celine?
Yeah.
Oh, no.
Yeah, I'm here. So I will stop sharing the screen. Yeah, so if you have any questions, please do not hesitate. You can just open your audio and ask directly, or you can post your questions on the chat box and I'll read it aloud.
Nobody interested. Okay.
Okay, let me ask Professor Song.
Yeah, Anilesh. Is it Anilesh? Yeah.
Yes, that's me.
Go ahead.
That's me. Professor Sparks, good afternoon, and thank you very much for sharing all the thoughts. And I'll start on a lighter note, that because today we were not able to see you, so it felt like it felt like a godly voice from the Western world, which we can't see, but we have to follow.
Fair enough.
but a bit of experience, and then I'll ask my question. So recently I submitted an article to a journal, and I got back, they sent me back saying that I need to do some revision. And one of the suggestions by the kind reviewer was that probably I should highlight the importance of the theory that I used in my article. And they said, if you highlighted that this theory is still relevant in the Indian or Asian context, then it would be much more acceptable. And what I wanted to say to the reviewer was that, no, that is not the objective of my article. I don't want to stress the importance of a theory which was developed 50 years ago in a very different context. That is precisely what I want to highlight in my article that is not applicable. So that is one of the problems that people like us who are new to the field face, that we have to abide by what has been happening for so long, or the traditions so far, to get published. But what is the role, Professor Sparks, of the kind of questions or the kind of inquiries we want to make, that it forces us to go back to the theories which were developed 40 years ago, 50 years ago, primarily in the Western context. So this whole idea of de-Westernizing, one of the problems is, I mean, do you think the problem stems from the idea of the kind of questions we frame and the kind of problems we want to investigate? Unless we have new questions related purely to our context, we will not be able to de-Westernize as the way we are hoping to, if that makes sense, Professor Sparks.
Yes, that does make sense. I mean, I don't really want to advise you on how to respond to that particularly irritating referee. But I think that the point that it illuminates is that the people who hold power in this journal, for example, are probably fairly committed to the Western trajectory, and are reluctant to admit that there can be alternatives. And I mean, this is why I don't know the answer. I mean, you know, I'm sure I've never said that to people, but I have said things which probably struck them as being equally problematic. And I don't know. I mean, I think there are three possible strategies. One is simply to do what they want, yes, to show how your work illuminates problems that they recognize as being serious. The second one is to reject their interpretation. I mean, this is not this particular case, but in general, is to reject the notion that you have to abide by the Western norms, and simply go ahead and develop the theories that you think are appropriate for the circumstances you wish to investigate. And that, I think, is morally the correct strategy to follow. But it's an enormously demanding strategy. I mean, there aren't, I mean, you know, if you look at, let's say, the Chinese Journal of Communication, yeah, its norms are Western norms. You look at Daya's journal, Global Media, its norms are less rigidly, but they're still Western norms. Finding an outlet, even, no, not necessarily the most prestigious outlet, but an outlet which is prepared to allow you the space to develop an alternative theory to account for an alternative reality, is, I think, very, very demanding. I'm not saying don't do it, but I'm saying that it's very demanding. I mean, I think, you know, I mean, when I was at Baptist, I had at one point the idea of setting up an open access journal, which you can do from almost nothing, and opening it to doctoral students from the Hong Kong universities. Oh, hello, I'm there. I'm visible. Can you see me? No?
Yes.
Ah, good. Lucky old you. Like I said, I'm not really white, I'm more pink. But it became very quickly clear to me that many of the people who I would wanted to publish in it didn't want to publish in it because it wouldn't be an SSCI journal. It wouldn't be a legitimate publication outlet, and they wanted that for you know, they rejected that idea for very good reasons. They wanted to get hired, you know, and they needed SSCI publications in order to get hired. So I mean, that project fell by the wayside. You know, I mean, it'd be very, very easy to do. You know, a journal dedicated to De-Westernizing Media Studies, looking at the looking at the names in front of me, I think the potential contributors are legion. I'm sure if you went to the Chinese U and City U and so forth, you would find other students with a similar appearance. But that's a choice which could have the wrong consequences. So I mean, I sort of have three alternatives, and the third alternative is simply to give up, which I don't think is very attractive. I mean, I think in any particular case, I come back to what I said earlier, think of which journals are most likely to be sympathetic. I mean, it's not that that I'm not the lone academic who recognizes these problems. There's lots and lots of scholars, who recognize these difficulties. But I'm looking. I mean, I don't know what field you're in English. I mean, if you were in cultural studies, I think you'd find it much easier. I think the International Journal of Cultural Studies, the Asian Journal of Cultural Studies, and so on would be much more sympathetic to people who, because their leading figures are trying a similar sort of project. I think that would be but if you're in communication studies, if you're in and I think you might find it more difficult. I mean, I'm much less familiar with that end of the field anyway. But try and find a journal which will give you the space to develop this. It doesn't have to be a top tier Q1 journal. It could be somewhat further down. But I mean, after all, the top tier reflects Western domination. It's got Western scholars in it. So if you're going to challenge that, I mean, yes, it'd be great to be in the Journal of Communication, but if the Journal of Communication tells you to go away, then find another journal. I mean, that's not a very satisfactory answer, but that's because I don't have a very satisfactory answer to what I think is a real problem.
Thank you, Bruce. Thank you so much for that.
Hello, Professor. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Hello.
Yeah. Hello. I just thinking about one difficulty for the de-Westernization of in the academia work. I think is one of the problem is to generalize the theory, because the Western countries, a lot of them they have some similar cultural or economic conditions and values. But in those kind of like developing countries or the southern countries, a lot of things are different. And you just mentioned about when we are writing the media system in China, and we can tell the reviewer like China is also a big country, have the second biggest media system. But I'm wondering about the situation about smaller countries like Thailand or Vietnam or like Ukraine, like those kind of countries. What are the situations the scholars from here they're facing when they are trying to publishing some of their the academia works from their context?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's not an accident that the two, I suppose, best known theorists of de-Westernization in the field of sort of cultural and media studies are Chen and Iwabuchi, both of whom are from big, well, Taiwan isn't big, but Chen sees himself as Chinese. Yes, he's not a Taiwanese, he's Chinese. At least he is now. They both put forward the idea of there being sort of a mutual exchange between different Asian countries. So on their account, I think they would say, look, someone from, let's say, Vietnam shares certain elements of culture with Japan, with Korea, with China, and so forth, and that there's a common space in which people can develop an alternative. And they look at things like, for example, the Korean wave, which they see as being an embodiment of and before that Japanese wave, being embodiment of alternative values to those embodied in Hollywood and in Western media in general, and that these can help you understand culture in Thailand or in Vietnam or wherever, as much as they can help you understand culture in Korea. I think that, I simply don't know. There was 20 years ago the notion that there was associated most clearly with Lee Kuan Yew, from Singapore, the idea of Asian values. Whether there are these uniform Asian values, the idea that these were Asian values was attacked very vigorously by Indian scholars. But whether there are within East Asia or Northeast Asia common values, I think is an issue worth exploring. I think the danger with it is if you're Vietnamese and you look at your history, cuddling China is perhaps not about as attractive as cuddling America or cuddling France. I don't know. I think that that both Chen and Iwabuchi address directly the issue of internal Asian imperialism. Iwabuchi tries to avoid it very strongly because he's Japanese, and Japan is the obvious instance of a country that as I said, adopted bad Western habits and built an empire. So I think, I suppose I would say that it's worth looking at what people like Chen and Iwabuchi have to say, and they've done a lot of work around this, and they've got I wouldn't say a school around them, but there's a current which I think it'd be worth seeing whether that provides some basis for a mutually, what they would say is a mutually supportive effort to address your own problems in your own way, I suppose, is what they're saying. You're not addressing this Saigon has not got the same problems as Dallas. Sorry, I know I don't have these answers. I'm trying, but I don't have them. Any other questions? Always the same two people who ask questions. Everybody else is asleep.
Thank you so much, Colin. Yeah, for this really very insightful talk. The way you conceptually distinguish internationalizing and de-Westernizing, I find it very, very enlightening. Thank you. So,
I must say, I must tell everybody that the only reason why I gave this talk is because Celine asked me to. This is not something I thrust upon you. Yes, it's not my natural home. Next week will be more my natural home. Okay.
So, if no more questions, thanks so much again to Colin for this wonderful talk. So, we look forward to seeing you next week.
I hope the system works better. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.